The year is 1854. The United States is a nation on the brink of transformation, grappling with deep-seated issues that threaten to tear it apart. The issue of slavery continues to cast a long shadow over the United States. This contentious topic has divided the nation, pitting North against South, abolitionists against pro-slavery advocates, and creating a chasm that seems impossible to bridge. In Washington, D.C., a new piece of legislation, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, ignites a firestorm. This act, proposed in the halls of Congress, is set to reshape the political landscape and intensify the debate over slavery. Introduced by Senator Stephen Douglas, the act aims to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Douglas, a prominent figure in American politics, believes that this legislation will pave the way for westward expansion and economic growth. However, it contains a controversial provision: popular sovereignty. This provision is a radical departure from previous policies and has the potential to change the course of American history. This doctrine dictates that the residents of these territories will decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. It places the power directly in the hands of the people, bypassing federal mandates and igniting fierce local debates. The Kansas-Nebraska Act throws a bomb into the already volatile issue of slavery's expansion. Communities are torn apart as neighbors find themselves on opposite sides of this deeply divisive issue. It effectively repeals the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This landmark agreement had maintained a fragile balance between free and slave states for over 3 decades. That compromise had prohibited slavery north of the 36 degrees, 30 minutes parallel. By overturning this provision, the Kansas-Nebraska Act opens new territories to the possibility of slavery, reigniting old conflicts. The Act's passage sparks outrage in the North, where many see it as a betrayal of principle. Northern abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates mobilize, organizing protests and rallies to voice their opposition. Abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates view popular sovereignty as a cynical ploy to expand slavery into new territories. They argue that it undermines the moral and political foundations of the nation. The South, however, largely embraces the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Southern leaders and citizens see it as a triumph for their way of life and a validation of their economic interests. Southern leaders see it as a victory for states' rights and an opportunity to expand their economic and political power. They believe that popular sovereignty will allow them to extend the institution of slavery into new territories, securing their influence for generations to come. The stage is set for a bitter and bloody struggle in the heartland of America. Kansas, once a quiet territory, will become a battleground for the soul of the nation. Kansas, once a quiet territory, will become a battleground for the soul of the nation. As settlers flood into the region, tensions rise and the conflict over slavery becomes increasingly violent. The Kansas-Nebraska Act has set the stage for a confrontation that will shape the future of the United States. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act triggers a mass migration to Kansas. Both sides of the slavery issue are determined to influence the territory's future. From the north, waves of free soil advocates pour into Kansas. These settlers, many affiliated with organizations like the New England Emigrant Aid Company, are committed to establishing Kansas as a free state. They bring with them their families, their belongings, and their unwavering belief in the immorality of slavery. Meanwhile, pro-slavery forces, primarily from neighboring Missouri, also stream into Kansas. Driven by a desire to protect their way of life and expand their economic interests, they too establish homesteads and communities. Tensions rise as these two diametrically opposed groups clash over land, resources, and ultimately the future of Kansas. The struggle for Kansas quickly descends into violence. Elections become fiercely contested, often marred by fraud and intimidation. Armed groups, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery, patrol the territory. These groups, with names like the Border Ruffians and the Jayhawkers, engage in raids, skirmishes, and acts of retribution. The idyllic vision of a peaceful settlement of the West crumbles under the weight of the slavery debate. The simmering tensions in Kansas were not just a local issue, but a reflection of the larger national conflict over slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had opened the territory to settlement with the contentious provision that the settlers themselves would decide whether to allow slavery. This principle of popular sovereignty led to a rush of both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers into Kansas, each side determined to sway the outcome. These tensions erupted into open conflict in 1855 as both factions clashed violently. The territory became a battleground, with skirmishes and raids becoming a common occurrence. The violence was not just spontaneous but often organized, with both sides forming militias and preparing for larger confrontations. A series of violent incidents, including the burning of homes and the murder of settlers, pushed the territory to the brink of civil war. The conflict in Kansas was a microcosm of the national struggle, with each incident adding fuel to the already raging fire of sectional tensions. One of the first major confrontations in this escalating conflict was the Wakarusa War. This brief but intense conflict in late 1855 was a significant escalation, drawing in hundreds of armed men on both sides. The Wakarusa War was sparked by a seemingly minor incident, a dispute over a stolen horse. However, this incident quickly escalated, pitting pro-slavery forces against Free State settlers. The conflict highlighted the deep divisions and the readiness of both sides to resort to violence. While the Wakarusa War resulted in relatively few casualties, it set a dangerous precedent for future violence. The willingness to take up arms over even minor disputes showed how volatile the situation had become. In May 1856, the tensions reached a new peak when pro-slavery forces, angered by the growing influence of the Free State movement, targeted the town of Lawrence. This attack was not just a spontaneous outburst, but a calculated move to strike at the heart of the anti-slavery movement in Kansas. Lawrence was known as a hub of abolitionist activity and had become a symbol of northern defiance. The town was home to several prominent anti-slavery leaders and institutions, making it a prime target for pro-slavery forces looking to make a statement. A mob of over 800 men, led by Sheriff Samuel Jones, descended upon the town with the intent to destroy it. This mob was not just a random collection of individuals, but an organized force with a clear objective. They looted homes and businesses, destroyed printing presses used to publish abolitionist newspapers, and burned down the Free State Hotel. The destruction was thorough and deliberate, aimed at crippling the anti-slavery movement in Kansas. The sack of Lawrence sent shockwaves throughout the nation. News of the attack spread quickly, and the brutality of the assault horrified many. Northerners were particularly horrified by the violence and destruction. The attack on Lawrence was seen as an assault on the principles of freedom and democracy, galvanizing public opinion against the pro-slavery forces. The incident further inflamed passions on both sides of the slavery debate. For many in the North, it was a clear sign that the South would stop at nothing to expand slavery, while Southerners saw it as a necessary action to protect their way of life. For many, the sack of Lawrence confirmed their worst fears about the intentions of the South. It was seen as proof that the pro-slavery faction was willing to use violence and intimidation to achieve its goals. The violence in Kansas was no longer a distant conflict. It had become a national crisis. The events in Kansas were a stark reminder of the deep divisions within the country and the lengths to which each side would go to defend its position. The conflict in Kansas was a precursor to the larger and more devastating conflict that would soon engulf the entire nation. Section 4. Retribution and Terror, John Brown and the Potawatomi Massacre. In the aftermath of the sack of Lawrence, a figure emerges from the chaos who will forever be linked with the violence of bleeding Kansas, John Brown. A fervent abolitionist, Brown believes that violence is necessary to purge the sin of slavery. Driven by a righteous fury, Brown and a small band of followers seek revenge for the sack of Lawrence and the perceived injustices against Free State settlers. On the night of May 24, 1856, Brown and his men descend upon a pro-slavery settlement near Potawatomi Creek. Armed with swords, they drag 5 men from their homes and brutally hack them to death. The Potawatomi Massacre horrifies the nation and transforms Brown into both a hero and a villain. For abolitionists, Brown becomes a symbol of resistance, a righteous warrior battling the evils of slavery. For many in the South, however, he is a dangerous fanatic, a terrorist who has unleashed a reign of terror in Kansas. The Potawatomi Massacre pushes the territory further into a spiral of violence and retribution. The lines between right and wrong become blurred in the fight for Kansas. Section 5. A Nation Aghast. The caning of Charles Sumner. The violence in Kansas spills over into the halls of Congress in 1856, a year marked by intense political and social turmoil. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a fiery abolitionist known for his passionate oratory, delivers a scathing speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas." His words are sharp and unyielding, reflecting the deep-seated anger and frustration of the abolitionist movement. In his speech, Sumner denounces the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a controversial piece of legislation that allowed the residents of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. He accuses pro-slavery senators of being complicit in the violence that has erupted in Kansas, painting a vivid picture of the atrocities committed in the name of expanding slavery. Sumner singles out Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, mocking his speech impediment and making inflammatory remarks about his relationship with the slave. His words are not just a political critique, but a personal attack designed to provoke and humiliate. 2 days later, Butler's nephew, Congressman Preston Brooks, approaches Sumner on the Senate floor. Brooks, a staunch defender of Southern honor, is incensed by Sumner's speech and feels compelled to respond. Armed with a heavy cane, Brooks brutally beats Sumner, striking him repeatedly over the head. The attack is sudden and ferocious, leaving Sumner bloodied and unconscious. The violence of the act shocks everyone present, turning the Senate floor into a scene of chaos and horror. The caning of Charles Sumner sends shockwaves through the nation. It is not just an attack on a man, but an assault on the very principles of democracy and free speech. It is a stark illustration of the deep divisions and raw emotions surrounding the issue of slavery. The incident highlights the growing chasm between the North and the South, a divide that seems increasingly insurmountable. The North is outraged by the attack on Sumner. Newspapers and public figures decry the violence, viewing it as an assault on free speech and a testament to the barbarity of the South. Sumner becomes a martyr for the abolitionist cause, his suffering symbolizing the brutality of slavery and the lengths to which its defenders will go. Northern citizens take to the streets in protest, and politicians use the incident to rally support for the abolitionist movement. The caning becomes a powerful symbol of the struggle between freedom and oppression, galvanizing public opinion against the pro-slavery forces. The South, however, largely applauds Brooks's actions, seeing him as a defender of Southern honor. Brooks is hailed as a hero, and his attack on Sumner is celebrated as a righteous act of retribution. The incident reinforces the South's commitment to preserving its way of life and its willingness to use violence to do so. The caning of Charles Sumner further polarizes the nation and pushes it closer to the brink of civil war. The incident is a microcosm of the larger conflict brewing in the country, a conflict that will soon erupt into one of the bloodiest wars in American history. The violence in the Senate is a grim foreshadowing of the violence that will soon engulf the entire nation, as the struggle over slavery reaches its inevitable and tragic conclusion.